We're just going to do a quick changeover, and I'll throw the ball. Chief, if you'll click that you'll accept that, then we'll see your screen.
Okay, click to accept.
Perfect. All right, that's coming up now.
I'm glad we got your technical support here as well, because I'd be lost by now. There we go.
It's kind of scary if I'm the technical support, but Chief Smith, thank you.
Okay, first off, I'd like to thank Jason and his staff for providing the invite. Quite an interesting conversation, subject matter, and the original plan was to discuss career versus volunteer fire service, and the truth is that the subject is far more dynamic than that. So hopefully today we're going to identify, looking beyond the facade of fire trucks. The reason why we use that as a title for this discussion is the perception battle, and a lot of the community, even local politicians and insurance providers, don't really have a full understanding of the dynamics that we deal with in our industry, and hopefully today we can shed some more light on that. Again, my name is Guido Smith. I'm with Farmington City Fire Department Fire Chief, and have the privilege of working with some of the most talented, gifted, and bravest people that we have in our communities. First off, I'd like to share with everyone our support of the 16 Firefighter Life Safety Initiatives, which is a nationwide program designed to promote the fire service, take us to that next step, and ensure that every one of our personnel goes home after the shift. It's a very well published and produced program, and encourage every one of you to visit the www.everyonegoeshome.com. A lot of information there which can benefit not just the fire service but the insurance industry as well. A couple of disclaimers that I want to share with everyone and the intent of this presentation. We're going to address just a few items, and we'll be talking about NFPA, and the picture is a lot bigger than what we're going to cover in the next 30 minutes. There will be some opinions that are shared, and I just want to, right off the get-go, share that everything that is stated here is to some degree from certain perspectives. The state of Utah alone is very dynamic in the different departments that serve their communities, whether it's Class 1 cities through the rural or frontier agencies. And just want to make sure that it's identified that everything that is expressed or discussed here is with the intent of improving services, and is not looking down on any agencies or communities that are unable to provide the services that are much needed. So let's do a quick review here. In the next 30 minutes, we're just going to identify volunteer combination career departments, get a better idea of what those words mean, the titles, local national statistics, and understanding delivery of services and community and industry expectations of fire departments. Once we've gone through that, we're going to put it all together and identify really what all that means and how it affects safety as well as liability potentials. So as we go into the different department types, keep in mind some of the terminology here may vary from place to place, but these are the most common titles. So as we look at the all-volunteer fire departments, typically all-volunteer, they are non-paid personnel, or in many cases not compensated, may staff or not staff stations, and the majority of them, true volunteer departments, at least in Utah, they'll respond from homes. They carry pagers that are tied into 911 dispatch centers. typically don't provide advanced services. However, that doesn't apply across the board. Most true volunteer or all-volunteer agencies respond for fire suppression and may provide basic EMS services as well. We'll talk more about that in a minute. NFPA compliancy, as far as 1720, you'll notice in the different categories here, I've listed those, and that's further discussion as we move on. So we look at costs for these services and why some communities opt to go with all volunteer, and it truly is a cost issue for most communities. It's minimal operational costs compared to combination or career departments. Cost to benefit discussion, I'm used to having this discussion with an active class group, so we'll keep that minimal for this presentation. However, there's a degree of cost to benefits for the different communities of why they opt to provide an all-volunteer level of service. As we move into combination, which represents the majority of fire departments, typically you'll have full-time and part-time paid personnel. Usually staffed a station or multiple stations 24/7, however, is not always the case. There are still communities where they are a combination by definition, however, they're not staffed at that facility 24/7. These departments will often provide full services as well as some specialty services depending where they are or what their community needs are. Again, I've listed there the NFPA 1710, 1720, just to get that number floating around a little bit and install that into everyone's memories. We'll be talking about that. Costs for combination fire departments is significantly more so typically than an all-volunteer, however, still remains slightly more efficient than career departments. And by efficient, it's not saying that career departments are not efficient, but there are some variables there as far as budgetary management and service costs. We move on to our career departments, and typically for all career, it's all full-time, may have a few part-time people that help augment staffing or facilitate special assignments. But typically everyone is on the payroll as a career, full benefit firefighter and staff. Usually the stations are staffed 24/7 in these areas, and again provide a full service, and often will provide specialty services that we'll talk about as well later. Career fire departments represent the minority of the fire service industry, both national and in the state, for the obvious reasons that we've already covered as far as cost. So let's take a quick look, and we'll play the perception game, which happens to everyone and most people, even a lot of our politicians. We deal with a lot of perception in our industry. Some of it's good for us, some of it's bad in the way that we give maybe a false sense of security. So there's three pictures that I've put up here on this screen, and numbered 1, 2, and 3, and that shows different fire departments and different apparatuses. And typically our community members, when they drive by, this is what they see. And so the question comes about to the group is, out of these departments, which one is a volunteer station, which is a combination fire department, and which one is all career? And the truth of the matter is, it could be any of them. Number one could be all volunteer. Number two could be the all career. And number three could be, it is truly a perception game, and something we need to educate our communities and our councils and insurance members is that what you see potentially could be a facade. We all strive to be the best that we can be and do the best that we can. However, at a glance, it does not necessarily represent the serviceability to a community or the safety to its firefighters. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit more about. So is the hazard potential different in communities protected by volunteer or combination departments compared to career departments? This is a question that I believe most fire chiefs try and educate their councils about. If we look at some of the pictures here, obviously we have residential structure fires, commercial, If you have a set of train tracks, you can have potential for hazmat. This is Utah. Topography is challenging. If we have roads and buses, any buildings that are made out of reinforced concrete, multi-story levels can pose hazards, bodies of water, and then interface. You'll also notice there, put a picture of an ambulance service, which typically represents 80% of our call volume, give or take. As we look at these pictures there as an illustration, I want to point out something. There's no Twin Towers. There's no terrorist attack. There's nothing big of world headlines. And the reason I make a point of not putting these pictures in my presentation is, as local communities, if we cannot address the emergencies or hazard potentials that we addressed here, we've lost the battle. We need to focus on providing the services and be capable of safely providing these services within our local communities before we even look at the global scale of things. So, as we talk about typical fire department services, and this is what our communities expect and a balance of what we're typically able to provide, we look at fire prevention, which is really a #1 objective in the fire service, plan reviews, building inspections, business inspections, and public education truly are the foundation of what we should be doing. And this is in your most rural fire station somewhere that's volunteer through your career staff Class 1 type cities. This truly is the largest component of our mission. Fire suppression, obviously, the expectations are we can handle residential, commercial, industrial, and it's important that we're able to protect our infrastructure as well. Rescue operations, most fire companies are able to mitigate to some degree vehicle extrication, victim removal, entrapped people from not just vehicles but structures, and basic search and rescue operations in communities, whether it be a missing child to something more complicated to searching for someone that's hiking. EMS, emergency medical services, typically most agencies provide a minimum of basic EMS response, maybe a first responder service, and many also provide advanced life support to various degrees, some with ambulance transportation and some that don't. On the hazardous material side of things, basic first response or operations level is the typical expectation of a fire department at a typical or service level provider. Let's talk a little bit about specialty services and how that ties in. Fire investigation, arson investigation, K9 assisted is one area that typically is a specialty because there's so much that's involved with it, as with some of these other topics. Under fire suppression, we may have industrial, airport, sea, air, and then obviously there are specialty incident command teams type 1 or level 1 incident command groups. Under rescue operations, we've got rapid intervention, urban search and rescue, ice rescue, high angle, and the list goes on there. In addition to the medical services, it may be advanced EMS services, paramedic level, specialty EMS teams, mass casualty incident response teams, as well as the tactical side of things as well. And on the hazardous materials, we get more into the technician level for the complex hazardous materials incidences, as well as the CBRN type response in the event of the big picture or terror response or chemical releases of some sort. If you notice here, again, I've put some pictures on to illustrate that these few specialty services, and the list goes on, a lot of these we are actually forced to deal with even at a local level. On fire investigations with arson, we at local levels are taking care of that even though we're maybe not equipped the way we'd like to be or ought to be to mitigate this. Rapid intervention, we already do that. We take care of our own people during fire calls and during emergency events to make sure that we have personnel in place to help the rescuers themselves if they get into trouble. Please note, all of these require manpower, they require staffing. If you have sewer systems, if you have any type of waterway systems, you can guarantee if there is potential, your local fire department will need to some degree, be able to mitigate to perform a rescue, which we'd rather do than victim removals. On the EMS front, the tactical EMS, medical, paramedic service is becoming more and more challenging as we deal with different acts of crime and in our communities that we serve. So, with that looked at, let's take a snapshot at some of our basic local and national statistics of what's going on in Utah. Just want to give a quick shout out to the State Fire Marshal's Office, who works very diligently to provide these statistics and was able to give me an update as of yesterday on some of our numbers. So as we look at 2013 as a baseline, in Utah, we had 99,700 plus fire and EMS responses. That's a lot of calls. Over $80 million loss of property damages, 6 civilian fatalities as an immediate result of the incident. That number is suspected to be higher, but as far as immediate impact, that's where we're at. 85 civilian reportable injuries, 11 reportable firefighter injuries, which is a very low and which is a very good year. And fortunately, we had 0 firefighter fatalities as a direct result of combat. And again, this represents, it typically is higher than that. So as we look at how many fire departments we have in Utah, current numbers show that we're at about 235 departments, with 187 of these that are actually registered with the federal government, and which goes to show that we still have a lot of very rural departments that are not involved with reporting to the United States Fire Administration, and that's unfortunate because being registered and being compliant also opens up a lot of access to grant funding opportunities. As we break down, as we said earlier, let's take a closer look at our statistics. We're at about 67% of all volunteer throughout the state of Utah. 25% of all the departments are combinations. So again, we have full and part-time personnel or full-time volunteer personnel. And then 7.6% is where we're at for our career rating in Utah. As we take a look more on a global level as far as the nation, these statistics, some of these are a little bit older, pulled from 2012 census, and some of the information here I was able to get for 2013. So there's approximately 30,000 fire departments throughout the United States, and these numbers here, as far as a breakdown, replicate similar or close to what we have in Utah. About 70% volunteer, 21% combination, 8% career. We have at least 1.4 million firefighters in the United States. That's a staggering number. Over 2 million fire and EMS responses on an annual basis. Now, let me throw a caveat there. Depending on what data you refer to, it's anywhere from 1.8 to as high as potentially over 4 million. Based on interfacility transports, how we determine, a lot of it is EMS driven on those numbers. So nationwide, let's take a look at some other statistics that are eye-opening for many of our viewers. Every year, we lose about $11.7 billion lost due to fires and other related emergencies. Over 3,000 civilian fatalities. You'll notice 61% male, 39% female. I thought that was interesting. So, gentlemen, let's be careful out there. 17,500 civilian reportable injuries. And then look at this number here, which is intriguing. 17,500 civilian, but 29,700 plus firefighter injuries. The job that we do is dangerous. We're getting hurt while we're out doing the job to reduce those civilian injuries. But we're, to some degree, we're taking the blunt of that statistic. So in 2013, according to NFPA, we had 97 firefighter deaths, which are immediate result of those incidents. 41 of those were volunteer, 25 of those were career, and 19 of those were wildland firefighters as well. Now, keep in mind when you compare the statistics of the volume of personnel, those do somewhat fall in line. Let's take a closer look, and again, this is just a snapshot. With that stated, this snapshot actually does represent the trend that we see, which is more of a detailed presentation of where our line of duty deaths are. We've broken down to the left side there, career firefighters versus volunteer firefighters. And there's some consistencies here that are easy to observe, and we'll be talking about these. So fireground operations, 48% for career firefighters, 41% for volunteer. Responding to and returning, so typically driving-related accidents, 3 for the career firefighters, 13 for the volunteer firefighters, and we break it further down into the non-operational and other training. For example, there was 10% with the volunteers and 4% with the career. One point I would like to make here, if it hasn't stood out for you already, is an emergency doesn't behave differently for a fire truck that shows up with volunteers on it versus career. Fires do not know the difference between a career firefighter or a volunteer. We're fuel, we're just another component, another part of the equation. And even though there are some subtle differences between the two, the actions that we need to take to improve firefighter safety is across the board. As we look at the nature of some of these fatalities, and again, these typically represent the trends, there are a few subtle differences for the year 2013. Obviously, traumatic injury, 24% for careers, 49% for the volunteers. Sudden cardiac death shows at 40% for the career firefighters and 34% for the volunteers. If you skip down a few lines, you'll notice that between stroke, cerebral hemorrhage, or cerebral vascular accidents, there's an additional 5% on the volunteer side that really could be lumped in with the cardiac. So we're talking apples to apples within reason there. Suicide is a concern as well. Although the numbers are lower, this is a larger problem in the fire service industry that I believe is being brought to light, and mental health for our personnel is obviously important. So as we take a look at the statistics at a local level, and as a fire chief, I could look at those and say, well, what do we need to do to improve this? There's a lot of evidence that supports that fireground safety and operations, effective code enforcement, so making sure we're building our buildings the way they're supposed to be, fire protection systems, sprinkler systems, is a huge area that needs to be addressed. Again, ounce of prevention, pound of cure. Our pre-planning of our crews, staffing is absolutely huge. We can talk about all these operations, special operations, but we need personnel who are trained and confident to do so to make it happen. Leadership development. Are we losing firefighters on firegrounds because we're making poor decisions as leaders, whether it's a volunteer department or a career department? Communication also is the first thing that typically fails and contributes to loss of life of firefighters. And obviously, as a local fire chief, zero tolerance towards freelancing. We need to make sure we know where our people are at all times. Wellness and fitness. We're falling left and right. Cardiac issues, strokes. It's important that we have fitness expectations, health monitoring, cancer screening, as well as access to mental health counseling. We talk about going to and from emergencies. Apparatus that is built to handle what we're using it for is important, as well as properly trained operators and proper maintenance of operating those apparatuses. Roadside safety and situational awareness. The freeways are becoming ever more so dangerous, and we are actually losing firefighters on the sides of freeways and roadways, so adopting third-party recognition programs such as the TIMS, the Traffic Incident Management Systems, as well as making sure that we utilize safety officers anytime we're out on roadways. Again, this ties back into personnel availability. Training safety. In our industry that we work, there really is no excuse for firefighter injuries or fatalities during training. However, it does happen. As a fire chief, I've lived through that where you do everything right and something still can go wrong. Training is an area that we can really achieve zero injuries, zero fatalities by more so thorough pre-planning of training. However, it can happen. One thing I do want to share with the group is this is a dangerous job, and it would be a disservice to those people out there that have given their lives in the line of duty not to acknowledge that we can do everything right and we can still end up with loss of life as a result. We can have a traffic incident set up perfectly and someone for some weird reason blows right through all of our safety precautions and results in injury or death. What we're talking about today is, and what we're identifying here is really to address that other, and I would like to say 80% of injuries or fatalities that could be avoided, whether it's career firefighters or volunteer firefighters. So let me challenge or throw a couple of questions here to the group. Is it up to each fire department to figure out what's best for its own safety? We get the numbers, they're out there on a national statistic. What may seem important for me could be different for another fire chief somewhere else. Wouldn't it be great to have proven templates to follow instead of reinventing the wheel? Well, how do we go about this? How do I make it safe? What should I be looking at to create a safer environment for my career firefighters or even my volunteer firefighters? So this is where we get to it. There are templates. There are proven templates. There's hundreds of thousands of hours that committees have worked on and put together templates that are there, and they're designed to help ensure we run efficient and safe processes. So here's a couple we'll talk about, the 1710, which is the standard for career fire departments. This standard actually outlines what the expectations are for a fire protection service that has career staffing. Emergency services delivery, response capabilities, what resources, staffing levels, response times. Yes, there are standards out there and recommendations for us to be on scenes within a certain amount of time with a certain amount of equipment in addition to a certain amount of people. Health and safety is addressed here, incident management, obviously communications and pre-incident planning. Funny how these expectations outline some of the things that we just addressed. And not just locally, but nationwide, we continue to not meet these standards, and we continue to see firefighter injuries and fatalities. Unfortunately, I believe, because we're not sticking to some of these templates. So the next slide, we're going to talk about NFPA 1720, and I'm just going to move back and forth a couple of times between these two slides. And as we look, I made a point of the same pictures at the bottom. Doesn't matter if we're full-time volunteer, Apparatus is Apparatus. This is the same station. And as far as the wording goes on top, 1710 compared to 1720, the only real change in the wording as far as what the NFPA represents, one is for career, the other is for volunteer in combination. Now, there are different standards that apply to the volunteer combination departments compared to career, but everything I read off earlier is in the same thing. So the point being is there are some different provisions, but the intent and the design of the template is still the same. We're protecting our firefighters. We're expecting a certain amount of training. We're expecting the credentialing, delivery of services, how long it takes to get to a scene. They all fall within similar parameters because fire doesn't know no difference. A fire doesn't burn slower because it's in a community that's protected by volunteers versus career. So Let's look at another standard here, which is a foundation of keeping our personnel safe, and that's the NFPA 1500, which is the Occupational Safety and Health. And basically it outlines the requirements, and I'm just going to read it right off. Requirements for members involved in rescue, fire suppression, EMS, hazardous materials, special operations, related activities. There are protocols in these standards that cover firefighter training, apparatus, protective clothing and equipment, physical requirements, and health and wellness programs. These recommendations, which they're spelled out, they're there. And I believe as an industry, we need to be taking a closer look at these and seeing how we can implement these within our means. So we've now addressed the service expectations and the safety expectations. Now let's boil it down to the firefighter level on fire personnel that are making that conscious decision to do this job as a volunteer, as a hobby, or as a career. There are expectations for firefighters of the schooling that they need, their health and physical standard to do this job, again, regardless of volunteer or career. And it is stated there under what is the NFPA 101. This is Utah, and we have a lot of wildland and interface areas, and there's NFPA 1051, which basically does the same thing, but it addresses the wildland expectations to make sure, and this is the key word, to make sure our personnel meet the minimum expectation. The sad truth is these are not mandated in Utah, and there's a lot of agencies out there that we have personnel executing these functions, and they do not even meet a minimum expectation. We identified that driving is also a large risk factor of the health and safety, not only of our firefighters, but of civilians out there as well. Typically, when we're involved in a collision, it's not fire truck and fire truck. It does happen from time to time, but the end result is we end up with civilian casualties or fatalities as well. It's a sad reality, but the truth is a lot of these can be avoided by training and setting mandates for certifications or qualifications. You have a 42-ton fire truck, a big ladder truck. It really is a responsible expectation for us to mandate that our personnel meet a minimum level of expectations and qualifications. NFPA 1002 does a great job in outlining this and needs to be taken serious by all communities. So we identified earlier on as well, leadership also ties into our statistical numbers with firefighter injuries and fatalities. We often make poor decisions, or poor decisions have been made on maybe trying to put a lot of risk into saving a structure that was going to get torn down anyhow. Are our fireground leaders, chief officers, do we have the training to make sure that every time we go out on that alarm, we are making well-balanced decisions based on education? Because if not, the intent is good, but the outcome could be horrendous. NFPA 1021 sets a very good basic expectation for fire company officers and leadership. Again, this is something, it's available out there, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Wellness and fitness, NFPA 1583 is one of several. Again, this is huge in the fire service. A lot of our fire personnel, again, career, volunteer, are becoming victims of sudden cardiac arrest or strokes. So what is NFPA 1583? It is a newer standard, a recommendation for us to follow. It's implementing and managing health-related fitness programs, roles and responsibilities of a firefighter, whether you're implementing fitness trainers or fitness assessments, we've got to make sure we take care of our personnel, and we need to educate them and promote education as well as collect data to make sure that when we're out there acting as athletes or NFL athletes, from 0 to 100 is the terminology often used, that our personnel are in the shape they need to be to go from doing training in a training room at a fire station to rescuing people out of a building or extricating people from a vehicle. In addition to that, even though we've moved on the slide, I just want to emphasize that the wellness fitness also identifies cancer screenings. Currently in Utah, we are not a presumptive state for cancers, and we have phenomenal people in the fire service that are trying to work with legislative committee groups to move forward with treating firefighters on a presumptive levels for certain cancers. Public safety personnel are dying after the fact. They were a hero years ago. They did their job. They did the right thing. But they're succumbing to these cancers, elaborate cancers, after the fact, often, many times, leading to early retirement, or they're affected by these cancers after retirement. And it's important we take care of these people and continue working in that arena. So, apparatus standards. We talked about vehicles. We know they're involved in collisions. We've talked about having the people trained to drive them. There are standards out there that really identify how these apparatuses should be built. Again, the right truck for the right job. NFPA 19.1 is a phenomenal template that applies to all types of the apparatuses in a wide range of vehicles, from pumpers to aerial devices, so on and so forth. If you're in a community and you see a nice shiny red fire truck, it can look great, but does it meet the standards that have been put together? Again, ounce of prevention, pound of cure. And for communities that do invest in apparatuses that meet these standards, are we then maintaining them? Too many times do we hear of fire trucks that lose their brakes, end up striking a structure or killing people, or unable to stop entering an intersection. Obviously, there's multiple variables. There are expectations out there for us to meet in maintaining our apparatus, and a few of them are making sure that we have an annual pump test. We have hose testing to make sure our hoses are operating properly. The SCBAs, the breathing apparatuses, have they been tested, and our personnel tested to make sure fit testing is appropriate. And I digress a little bit there, but these standards are in place, they're accessible, and they're important that we try to adhere to them, or we at least pay attention to them. So let's move on to fire stations and where our people are staffed. How safe are our buildings? And the truth is, right now, there isn't a fire station specific NFPA, but there are numerous NFPA articles that could apply to that. NFPA 1 in regards to making sure that our fire stations are sprinkled for life safety, in addition to the life safety standards of 1500. And as you look down the list there, there's a couple to include 1221, that's the communication systems, so that as we respond to calls, we take calls, dispatch is able to communicate with the crews to give them that vital information before they leave the station. Now, I know we're moving along here. Again, this is an 8-hour conversation, and we're condensing it to a 30-minute presentation. So let's talk a moment about third-party validation. The Utah Government Trust is one that I would consider third-party validation. I personally, as a fire chief, encourage them to come into my station and walk through and give recommendations of things that they see, and I appreciate Jason and his staff for doing that recently as well. On the other side of the spectrum, I've referred to NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association, throughout this presentation. They're technically a nonprofit organization, and I'm going to read this word for word because I don't want to get myself into trouble. But NFPA creates codes and standards for local governments to adopt. It is not mandated to do so, nor is it law. With this stated, an increasing amount of legal cases brought before the courts often refer to NFPA as a credible and prudent standard to be followed, regardless if the agency in question adopted the standard or not. It is speculated that NFPA documents may be used to persuade juries that of an agency was in fact negligent because they weren't NFPA compliant. This isn't a scare tactic. I believe this is reality. There are documents out there, there are industry standards that are provided nationwide, and I believe, and the fire services and industry, depending who you talk to, believes the day may come where if there is a significant loss of property or life, a city, a municipality, a fire district may be challenged for not complying with response times. That loss would not have occurred if the fire crews were there in the right number, the right equipment, in a decent amount of time, and therefore could have prevented unnecessary loss of property or loss of life. These are the challenges we're going to face in the future, and we need to pay attention to these standards, even though they're not mandated right now. Of their value. One area I see this being especially important is the qualifications for fire personnel, leadership personnel, as well as the health and safety of our personnel. Let's talk a little bit about ISO, which is the Insurance Service Office. And this is a for-profit organization that they evaluate local communities. Again, it doesn't matter, volunteer or career. They evaluate the communities and provide a score based on fire department operational capabilities, water distribution capabilities, and the dispatch center capabilities. The scores typically range from 1, which is the best, to 10. And that information is then shared with insurance companies that determine applicable rates and premiums for a given community. Let's step back to the firefighter level and credentialing of fire service personnel. Third-party validation, one is the International Fire Service Accreditation Congress, which is also known as IFSAC, and Pro Board Fire Service Professional Qualification Systems. These are two international accreditation agencies, organizations that are utilized through the University of Utah or the Utah Fire Rescue Academy. I meant Utah Valley University, sorry. They participate in these programs in many departments throughout Utah. Volunteer, combination, career can benefit from these programs. There's a lot of grants out there for smaller volunteer fire departments to where they have very little financial obligation to achieve these certifications that are not only locally recognized, but they're internationally recognized. The sad part of this is these are not mandated throughout Utah. It is still optional, and there's a lot of departments out there that have firefighters that are out on the streets doing the job, and they do not have the certifications. The message I'd like to share with everyone here is there's a lot of work has been put into providing this education and recognition, a lot of grants, and it's not very difficult. And we still have, I believe, a lot of agencies that don't take advantage of this. It's important we achieve this. We need to get our people certified, and we need to make sure it's on a measurable measure, not just local or national, but even internationally. So let's put it all together. We've identified difference between volunteer, combination, and career staffing. We've talked about services that we provide as a basic level and some advanced services. We've looked at some local and national statistics. We've identified immediate areas of improvement to affect the statistics that we face year after year after year. We've identified standards to be used in part or in full, such as the NFPA recommendations. And we've identified the need for third-party validation, ISO, NFPA, Pro Board. It's out there, and it's all ready for us to use. So where's the next step from this? Hopefully the group that we've talked to today, I know it's quite an array in the industry, this is where we're at. Need to take a look beyond the facade of the shiny fire trucks at a station and talk to your local fire chiefs about measurable standards and where they are at. What's their staffing levels? Are we getting, how many people are we getting on scene within 4 minutes after getting our guys bunkered up and out the station? How many people are on scene at an 8-minute interval? Are we running our fire grounds safe? And it doesn't mean everyone has to staff 10 people at each station. It may be a combination of making sure you have automatic aid in place so neighboring cities are helping out so we achieve these measurable standards. Response times. Is it acceptable in your community to have 13, 14-minute response times and maybe in a non-rural or a non-frontier area? That's a whole nother discussion. Qualification certifications. Is there a reason not to have firefighters that are certified, EMTs that are certified, your leadership group that meet a basic and easy to access qualification criteria? Wellness and fitness. Are our personnel safe? Are they fit to do the job that we're expecting them to do? And the truth is, if you're in a rural community and you say we may have one fire every 3 years, it doesn't matter. Is that person capable of doing the job once in 3 years? Apparatus compliancy, this is huge as well. In the fire service, we have a history of making do with what we've got. We all do it, and to some degree, we owe that to our community and our taxpayers to make sure that we're being prudent with our equipment and we're trying to achieve as many objectives as possible when buying that piece of equipment. However, there are recommendations and standards for the age of an apparatus, safety inspections, maintenance expectations, and does your local community or does the fire chief have replacement plans in place? Does the municipality that maybe you're working with, do they have a replacement plan in place? Critical equipment annual testing, let's review that again. Fire pumps, hoses, fire ladders, the SCBAs, and even the fill stations and stations that we use for our compressors, as well as the PPE that we wear, that our firefighters wear. Have they expired? Are they still safe to use? Have they been inspected? There's a purpose for this, and it equates to money. Policies and procedures. Doesn't matter if you're full-time, volunteer, career, combination. It's important that our personnel have policies, procedures for consistency, and that our day-to-day operations are the same. So, with that said, and I believe I'm within the time frame here, once this is completed, there's a couple of questions we need to ask. Are you happy with the results of what you've received back from your local fire chief or government? Are you concerned about life safety? Are you concerned about liability? Is the municipality that you represent really putting themselves out there on a financial level? It's time to speak up, as your input or your voice may be the one that would make the difference between life or death of civilian firefighters in the community that you're involved with. With that said, any questions or comments?
Well, thank you so much, Chief, for that presentation. That is great. Just very thoughtful, comprehensive. You spent a great amount of time. Every question that I kept coming up with, you answered. You did a great job in the presentation. I did have one question from a little earlier, talking about CERT and USAR groups. The question was, how much training do you do with CERT and USAR, and are they volunteer?
Okay, and that's a great question. The CERT teams that we work with, and I can obviously only speak for the area that we serve, they are a volunteer group. In our particular area, a lot of them, the CERT team is coordinated with the local church groups. So there is some training. We do network with them and provide our facilities as well as instructors for the training. They are strictly volunteer, and there are some provisions for liability in the event they're injured during an operation or a task that they would be covered for injuries sustained.
Great, great. And just want to remind people that they can type, any participants can type your questions into the chat box or the Q&A box, and we'll field those there. Chief, did you have something else to add there?
No, just as far as the USAR question, we build regional task force groups. Obviously, no single city, at least in Davis County, can take everything on. So Davis County, I believe, is a great role model for others to look at of not only mutual aid, but automatic aid, hazardous materials response. We've been able to network closely where we share the burden of putting together a task force as a specialty. The same with wildland and mass casualty incidences. It's not about having your own government provide all services that can handle or mitigate every imaginable incident. It's about pre-planning and networking with other cities and communities to make sure that when the time comes, everyone can pull together and hopefully not only mitigate the incident, but do it safely.
Great. So here's a question, Chief. You've done an excellent job outlining standards and direction that we should be looking. The question is, where do you start? So we've got there's a great amount of we have all of these standards. Where would somebody start to really address this issue?
I think as far as, you mean fire service-wise?
Yeah, fire service. How,
okay.
we've outlined a lot of standards. What's kind of the first step if we identify, hey, we need to step up in one category or another? What's the first step?
I think the first step is reach out and utilize resources that are available to you. We have a phenomenal Fire Marshal's office in the state of Utah, a great resource. We have other Utah State Fire Chiefs Associations. There's a lot of organizations out there. Utah Fire Rescue Academy itself is a phenomenal resource. It really boils down to networking, taking that first step to reach out and say, hey, does anyone have some information on this? Has anyone gone through these steps? That would be my recommendation for the first step. Obviously, you can go out and invest in the NFPA literature, which is, again, a great resource. The key to that is once you have that information, you actually do something with it. You've got to get in. It is tedious, and you've got to read it. You've got to put an outline together. Empower your leadership groups. For some rural agencies, maybe the leadership group is the chief by himself. However, networking, I believe, is the most effective and immediate way to get started. Not only at a local level, you can reach out to the National Fire Academy. The list goes on. Great.
The one thing that popped into my mind on that is along your networking when it comes to policies and procedures, those type of things. That's one great thing that I've found working in the public sector is we don't have to worry about trade secrets. We can share and pass that type of information. If there's something that works really well, let's share. Let's work together. Great.
Absolutely.
Just looking at, I don't see any other questions. Any questions from Brent or Doug? Anything to add from the loss prevention side of things? Hearing none.
And let me just put the shout out there. If anyone would like to contact me, I may not have the answers, but I'm more than happy to help out any way that I can. My email address is posted and my office number there as well.
Awesome. We just wanted to express our appreciation one more time to Chief Smith for spending time preparing this presentation and sharing the information. It definitely will spark some conversation and hopefully some additional webinars from this. And we'd love to hear your feedback. If you have some thoughts about this, comments, or items to share. We really want to hear that from you. So, okay. Thank you very much, Chief. I appreciate it, and just encourage everybody to go out and have a safe day. Thanks so much.
Thank you.